All right. Well, hello, everyone. So today's lecture is a pre-recorded lecture. As I mentioned last time, I'm doing it this way because I have a guest speaker in another of my classes on Tuesday. Now, I have to get them to and from the university. And so, rather than trying to do all of that in between all of my classes today, which would be impossible, I am simply doing a not live version of our lecture. So thank you for joining me today. This is like a live premiere, I suppose, on YouTube. This is the first time I've done something like this. But this was the best solution given all of my scheduling commitments. So what we have to do today is finish off our look at the first half of chapter 11 in Crumley right here. Hey, maybe this could be my thumbnail. Yeah, thumbnail. Okay. Maybe that will be cool. I don't know. God, it feels weird talking to you all as if you're here, even though you're not. But anyway, so the first thing we've got to do is get through all of that, finish off our look at the other two arguments for God's existence. So last time we talked about some terminology, we talked about the divine attributes, and then we went over the teleological argument. So today, to finish that bit off, we're going to be talking about the cosmological argument and the ontological argument. Then we'll move on to consider the problem of evil. Before we do that, a bit of housekeeping. Um, excuse me. Your third quiz is now live. Now, this quiz is a little bit different than previous quizzes. There are no true and false or multiple choice questions. Uh, it's just, um, I think the number is 6 short answer questions, one from each chapter since the previous quiz. Again, it's open book, like always, so you can read your textbook. You can have your textbook there with you when you complete the quiz. You can refer to your notes. You can refer to my slides, whatever you need to do. Just a reminder, because I had some incidents of this last time. Don't copy and paste anything, not even from your own notes. And absolutely no use of search engines and no use of generative AI. But that quiz is open for you. I recommend that you complete it after you've watched this lecture. And you will have until 11:59 p.m. this Friday. That's the 5th to complete it. Okay. So that is the housekeeping business. Let us finish off our discussion of the arguments for God's existence. So, as I said a moment ago, um, we previously left off right around the end of our discussion of the teleological argument, which is sometimes also known as the design argument. The teleological argument goes roughly as follows, and this is the version that is due to William Paley. Um, Imagine that you were out in the wilderness and you encountered a watch laying there on the ground. You would infer on the basis of the design of the watch, namely that it is an artifact, a designed artifact, that it must have a designer. Similarly, Paley argues when we look at the natural world, there is evidence of design. And so we infer the existence of a designer, and the designer is, of course, God. We looked at some counter arguments to this too. One was Dawkins's argument that design in nature can be explained um, owing to the blind watchmaker of evolution. Um, we looked at another possibility where instead of regarding design or function or purpose in nature teleologically, we look at it um, teleonomolo- te- teleonomologically. That's a mouthful. We're talking about teleonomy, not teleology. My hand shows evidence of design because, during my development, uh, my hand was grown based upon the designs in my genetic code, right? That's teleonomy, not teleology. Okay, so that's enough for recap. Now let's talk about the cosmological argument. Now, the cosmological argument first asks us to note how there are lots of different kinds of beings whose existence is contingent upon something else, usually another being. So contingent here means it depends upon something else. So my existence is contingent upon my parents, right? Likewise with all of you. Um, how did you get here? What brought you into being? Well, your parents did, right? Um, what else? Well, we can talk about artifacts like this coffee cup. So represent CKCUFM, Carleton University Community Radio. You should listen to it. This coffee cup, its existence is contingent upon the coffee cup's maker. So its existence is contingent, you could say, in Aristotelian terms, on its efficient cause. Um, and this goes for apparently, ostensibly, everything. But we ask, is there a being whose existence is not contingent, but rather necessary? Well, cosmological arguments try and show us that God's existence is necessary. And you can think back, firstly, think in terms of logical necessity here, and think back to the divine attributes, right? God is necessarily omnipotent. God is necessarily omniscient, omnipresent, etc. Um, but the idea behind the cosmological argument is, of course, that all um, that all beings' existence is really contingent upon another being in some way, except God. God necessarily exists. Um, Another way you can look at this is, if you've ever asked yourself this question, and I certainly have. In fact, I kind of come back to this question not only when I'm teaching this course, but sometimes I'm just thinking, I'm just pondering, and I think to myself, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do things exist? Couldn't it just as easily have been the case that there is nothing? Well, things do exist. There are things, but all things have been caused by other things. So, in the sense that my existence is contingent upon the existence of my parents, you could say that I was caused by my parents, right? But is it just contingent beings all the way down? Is it just causes all the way down? Well, the cosmological argument says that there must be some uncaused necessary being as the source of all existence. And as you may have guessed, that being is God. Now, it's worth noting that, like the design argument, the cosmological argument is also an a posteriori for argument for God's existence. And we're going to look at a version of this argument that is due to Thomas Aquinas. This is from his third way, the third of the five ways. The five ways are Aquinas's arguments for the existence of God. Here's what Aquinas says in the third way, quoted in Crumley. He says, "Our experience certainly includes things capable of existing, but apparently unnecessarily. That is contingent, since they come and go, coming to birth or dying. But if it is unnecessary for a thing to exist, it did not exist once upon a time. And yet everything cannot be like this, for if everything is unnecessary, there was once nothing." So things come and go, which is what uh, we observe, that things come and go. So we know that these things that we encounter don't exist necessarily. They are contingent. Their existence is contingent. Um, but if everything is unnecessary, then there was once nothing. But if such were the case, to continue, there would now be nothing, because a non-existent can only be brought into existence by something already existing. So that if ever there was nothing, not a thing could be brought into existence, and there would be nothing now, which contradicts the facts. So if there was nothing, and the existence of all things, all beings, is contingent, there should still be nothing now. Yet there are contingent things, contingent beings that exist now. And that requires a first cause, right? A sort of Aristotelian prime mover, if you like. And so, Aquinas continues, not everything um, can be an unnecessary kind of being. There must exist some being that necessarily exists, that is, that logically necessarily exists. But a thing that necessarily exists may or may not have this necessity from something else. But just as we begin somewhere in a succession of causes, the case is the same with any succession of things that necessarily exist and receive this necessity from others. Hence, we are compelled to suppose something exists necessarily, having this necessity only from itself. In fact, it itself, the cause why other things exist, and that is God. God necessarily exists, and it necessarily exists from itself. It is a sort of uncaused cause that causes everything else to exist, a first cause, if you like. Now, what do you make of this argument? Well, it's really up to you. I am glossing over some of the ideas in the textbook here. I would like to hear from you, except I'm not delivering this lecture live. So we can't really do that. But I would put the question to you, and you can talk about this in the live premiere chat amongst yourselves, or we could even reflect on this a little bit next time when we see each other Thursday for our wrap-up lecture. But ask yourself whether the idea of God as an uncaused cause makes sense to you. Does the idea of God as an unmoved mover make sense to you? Or ask yourself the following, right? We find ourselves in this universe which seems, based upon the best science that we have, physics, astronomy, etc., seems to have had a beginning. We call that beginning the Big Bang. Now, astronomers and physicists, many of them were initially quite skeptical of this idea. Edwin Hubble observes a red shift in the light from galaxies that he looks at through his telescope. Edwin Hubble is the astronomer after whom the Hubble telescope was named. He wasn't using the Hubble telescope; he was using telescopes on Earth, but he observed a red shift in these images of galaxies that he took through this telescope, which indicates, and without getting into the science, which indicates that they are moving away from us. And so this was some of the first evidence we had that the universe was expanding. And if you wind the clock back, the universe must have begun at a single event about 13.5 billion years ago that we now call the Big Bang. Not everyone was convinced, right? The name Big Bang was in fact uh, or is in fact due to an astronomer by the name of Fred Hoyle, who called it the Big Bang because he thought it was ridiculous. The universe just starts in some Big Bang. Oh, okay. Hoyle was, of course, an advocate of something called steady state theory, which says that the universe had always existed. But now we know there is so much evidence for the Big Bang. So the universe had a beginning. But what was the cause of the universe? There are lots of theories. Maybe our universe emerged in this Big Bang after a previous universe collapsed in a big crunch. Maybe our universe is part of a multiverse, although that does seem to violate Occam's razor. Maybe God created the universe. Maybe God is the cause of the universe. Perhaps you could say God caused the Big Bang. What do you think of that? If you find it convincing, fine. But I ask you, why does the universe require a cause and God does not? Why? Is this just special pleading? think about it like this. We don't know what caused the universe to come into being, what initiated the Big Bang. We need a cause. Well, God. Okay. Well, what caused God to come into being? Well, God is an uncaused cause. God doesn't need a cause. Well, all right. But why then does the universe need a cause? Could the universe be an uncaused cause? If you're a pantheist, maybe there's no problem in thinking about things like this. A pantheist or a panentheist. The God is everything or God is within everything. Well, if the universe is God or God is immanent within the universe, present in all things at all times, then there's no problem for you, right? You have your uncaused cause. The universe, God, both same thing, an uncaused cause. But for those of you who are perhaps theists or deists, you might not be so eager to accept this idea. But I do encourage you to think about it. All right. So that's it for the a posteriori arguments for God's existence. We're going to go over to the other slides now and talk about an a priori argument for God's existence, um, which is the ontological argument. And then we're going to talk about the problem of evil. All right. All right. So now let us kick off the next set of slides. Now we're talking about the ontological argument. There have been many, many different versions of this argument offered by quite a number of different thinkers. But the version that we're going to look at, and the original version, was given by Anselm of Canterbury, who lived on the tail end of the 11th century into the 12th century AD. Um, as I mentioned before, just to reiterate, where the design argument and the cosmological argument are a posteriori, the ontological argument is rather an a priori argument. And what it asks us to do is reflect upon the nature of God, and specifically the perfection of God, in order to demonstrate the existence of God. It's meant to be a sort of master argument, right? A sort of knockdown that would convince even the most staunch atheist that God exists. Here is what Anselm says, again quoted from Crumley. He wrote, "Now we believe that you, God, are something than which nothing greater than can be thought. So can it be that no such nature exists, since the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." That's from Psalm 14:1. So even the fool must admit that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists, at least in his understanding, since he understands this when he hears it. Okay, so just to make sure you all understand what that means, we're being asked to imagine something greater than which nothing else can be thought. That thing is God. The greatest thing that you could possibly conceive of in your understanding. That is God. Okay. And further, even the fool, right? Even a fool who doesn't believe in God, even an atheist, could conceive of this being than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so that's the first part. And surely that than which nothing greater cannot be thought cannot exist only in the understanding. For if it exists only in the understanding, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But that is clearly impossible. Therefore, there is no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the understanding and in the reality. That last part is very wordy and very tricky, but what it means is this. Okay, we've imagined something greater than which anything else could be thought. That's God. Even the fool can do this. But isn't it greater to exist in reality than merely just in the understanding? It's greater to exist in reality and in the understanding than simply in the understanding. But hang on, we've already conceived of this thing that is greater than which anything else can be thought. So it must necessarily exist because greatness, well, it's greater to exist in reality and in the understanding than merely in the understanding. So if you can conceive of this greatness, that is the greatest thing that can be thought, it must necessarily also exist in reality as well as in the understanding. This is how we schematize it, right? God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, for the first premise. God, which is the entity than which nothing greater can be thought, at least in the understanding. And either that which nothing greater that can be thought exists only in the understanding, or in the understanding and in reality outside of the mind. Now it's clearly greater, the argument goes, to exist outside of the mind than to exist only in the mind. So if God really is the being that is greater than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must exist um, in reality as well as in the understanding. Therefore, we conclude that God exists. Notice that this our whole argument turns on a shared conception of God as a perfect being. That's what Ansel means when he says greater than any other thing that we can think of, anything else that we can conceive. It's perfect, a perfect being, perfectly omniscient, perfectly omnibenevolent, perfectly omnipotent, etc. And Anselm would also say that this argument is even the sort of thing that an atheist could understand. Right? So, all you atheists out there, are you convinced? Well, I'm not, speaking for myself as an atheist. And remember, I'm not trying to tell you all what to believe, merely how to think. But there is a problem. There is a problem with this argument, and it's identified by another monk named Guanilo. So Guanilo, no atheist, identified the problem, and that problem is that the existence of a perfect anything can be proved with this argument. Guanilo's example was that of a perfect island. He said the following. He said, "Suppose someone tells me all this," the ontological argument. "The story is easily told and involves no difficulty, and so I understand it. But if this person went on to draw a conclusion, say, oh, by the way, this, we're talking about an ontological argument for the perfect island here. So there's a perfect island that exists in the understanding, an island more perfect than which anything else can be thought. So suppose someone tells me all this. But if this person went on to draw a conclusion and say, you cannot any longer doubt that this island, more excellent than all the others on Earth, truly exists somewhere in reality, for you do not doubt that this island exists in your understanding. And since it is more excellent to exist not merely in the understanding, but also in reality, the island must also exist in reality." Now, I happen to agree with this criticism. This criticism, which runs as follows: instead of God, we plug in this notion of a perfect island, and I say, imagine an island more perfect than than any other island that can be conceived. It has the perfect temperature, the perfect climate. Fruits grow on the trees all year round. It has the most delicious creatures that live on it, that are easy for you to obtain, shall we say. So anytime you're hungry, there are fruits on the trees, there are fish in the sea, there are animals on the land. It's a veritable Garden of Eden, a paradise. Um, and then you say, okay, I understand. Yeah, that's a pretty perfect island. I can't conceive of an island better than that island. Anything you want. It has perfect. It's not only a Garden of Eden. It has perfect Wi-Fi, right? So you can keep in touch with your loved ones while you're on this perfect island. It's easy to get to, et cetera, right? But hang on. It would be greater if the island existed in reality, if it is this most perfect island. So therefore, this island must exist, right? Well, no, you would probably say you haven't proven anything with this argument. You know, just because I can conceive of this perfect island and it's greater to exist in reality and the understanding, and in the understanding, rather than merely in the understanding, that does not mean this perfect island exists, right? But others claim that maybe Anselm or maybe Guanilo has misunderstood Anselm's argument. Because after all, islands are contingent things, and God is not supposed to be contingent. God's existence is supposed to be necessary. So maybe Anselm would respond by saying that your island is an example of the most perfect kind of thing, which may not necessarily exist in reality. But God is the most perfect thing that we can conceive of and must necessarily exist in reality on that basis. Another criticism of the ontological argument comes from Kant, Immanuel Kant. Um, Kant actually does a different thing than Guanilo. What he does is deny that existence is a property or a perfection. He means, when he says this, he means that we don't really add anything to a concept um, by saying it exists. It's a different sort of thing than attributing properties to the concept. So, one of the examples, it's not really an example, but something that Crumley gestures at is that this sort of way of thinking about existence and properties of beings is borne out in the way that we do logic. Um, like the existential quantifier occupies a different place when we're writing out, say something in like predicate logic. Um, occupies a different place than the properties that we attribute to an object. Now, maybe a proponent of Anselm's argument would say, well, in some cases, existence does add something. But again, I leave it to you whether you find Kant's criticism more convincing or Anselm's argument more convincing. Or you can take the line of argument that Charles Hawthorne or Hartshorne, excuse me, and Norman Malcolm take. They make reference to a different formulation of the ontological argument, where Anselm says, "For it is possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist, and such a being is greater than one that can be thought not to exist." Um, so we're talking about necessary existence, not just mere existence as the perfection of God. And what Malcolm is doing here is saying that God's existence is either necessary or impossible, but since the concept of God is not self-contradictory, God's existence is possible rather than impossible. Sorry. Therefore, God's existence is necessary. This is kind of a conceivability argument. Um, Hartshorne makes a similar proof with modal logic. We're not going to look too deep into this, but I just want you to be aware of these versions of the arguments. What do you make of them? Discuss in the chat or in the Discord server if you like. All right, now let's look at the problem of evil. Speaking of evil, this is my cat. Just thought I'd introduce him to all of you. Okay, you can go now if you want. He loves to come up on my desk when I'm working. But not today. Oh, here's his tail remains in frame. Well, all right. So, oh, here you are. Let's talk about the problem of evil. What do we make of the existence of evil in the world? What do you make of it, sir? Oh. Well, there's a couple different kinds of evils that we could talk about. There are moral evils. These are the evils that humans commit. So we're talking, all the terrible stuff: murder, torture, genocide, rape, um, causing harm to any kind of harm to any creature, really, other humans, other animals, right? All of these are moral evils. The bad things that we do are moral evils. But there are also natural evils. These are evils that occur in nature, or we could say acts of God. The one that Crumley refers to is the Lisbon earthquake. So this happened in Lisbon, Portugal in 1755, and it killed thousands and thousands of people. It's referenced by Voltaire in his book Candide, in fact. So those are two sorts of evils. Then we've got two versions of the problem of evil: the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. Each version, they're subtly different, but each version poses a challenge um, to the idea of the existence of an omnibenevolent or all-good God. So now we're going to look at each of these versions of the problem in turn. The first one that we'll look at is the logical problem of evil. And this is due to J.L. Mackie. Oh, there's a spelling mistake there. Mac. It's supposed to say Mackie. Mackie held that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of an omnibenevolent God. This is how Crumley sketches the argument. First premise: God exists and is omniscient, omnipotent, and all good, or omnibenevolent. The second premise states that evil exists. The third premise states that an omnibenevolent being, an all-good being, would not permit evil. The fourth says that an omnipotent being could prevent the occurrence of evil because he's all-powerful. An omniscient being, as it says in the fifth premise, would know of any instances of evil. So God cannot be all good or all powerful or all knowing if evil exists. These are logically incompatible with one another. Um, I like the way Epicurus puts it. Here he's quoted in I believe this is actually the words of Lucretius. I could be wrong about this. Somebody might want to check me on this. But they're attributed to Epicurus. Um, anyway, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So we've got this being that's supposed to be perfect in the sense that he's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Um, as an omniscient being, he would know of any instances of evil. As an omnipotent being, he could prevent evil. And as an omnibenevolent being, he should not permit evil. Yet evil exists. So something's got to give. Now, this argument does not entail that God does not exist. At minimum, what it says is that if God exists, um, he is not omnibenevolent or omnipotent. That's one way you can understand it. You can also understand it as saying that, as ultimately trying to convince you that God just does not exist. But if he does exist, he's either not all powerful or not all good or not all knowing. And those are supposed to be the perfect divine attributes that God is supposed to have these. Alvin Plantinga famously responded to this argument by saying God couldn't have created people, humanity, as genuinely free creatures if he completely disallowed evil, the existence of evil. This is something we call the free will theodicy. Human beings are free. That's the argument. I mean, maybe you disagree with that. Maybe you'd argue, maybe you're a determinist and you don't think that we're free. But if you do believe that human beings are free, you have to grant that some of them will choose to do evil. I mean, this is the whole idea, right? If you're a subscriber to one of the Abrahamic religions, you probably believe that this life is in some important sense a test. All right, think about it. We'll stick to the Abrahamic religions, right? But if you're Jewish, the point of life is to live a godly life by following the laws that God has laid down for you, right? If you're a Christian, you are supposed to accept Jesus as your savior, and live according to his example, and live according to most of the laws, not all of them, but Ten Commandments are pretty important. Um, if you're a Muslim, you're supposed to submit to God and sort of reconnect with your true self, your primordial self through this submission. Um, but not everyone does that, right? People decide not to do this. Um, and the way that these religions characterize it is that this is a sort of rebellion or rejection of what you're supposed to be doing in order to achieve salvation, whatever that might mean. So, in order for us to be free and to think back to our unit on free will, to be praised or blamed for our actions in this instance by God, we have to be free. Some of us are going to choose wrong. Some of us are going to not only choose wrong, we're going to commit evil deeds. Um, so, in order for human beings to be free, God has to allow some evil to exist. Or you could look at it like this. You might say that some evils are only apparent. Maybe some evils are necessary for a greater good. I have a hard time with this one because, I think of natural evils. Where is the good in a natural evil like the Lisbon earthquake? Um, where's the good in, a child suffering from a disease like cancer? Where's the greater good in that? Um, yes, this is my opinion. Okay. I'm not trying to, once again, tell you what to think, but I personally have a real hard time with that one. There's a lot of unnecessary suffering. That gets us to the evidential problem of evil, which we'll cover in a moment. The point, though, is that Plantinga would say that the existence of evil actually isn't logically inconsistent with the existence of an omnibenevolent God, because God has to allow some evil in order for us to be free. He's created us as free beings with free will who can choose. And so some of us are going to commit evil. And then that's not inconsistent with the idea of God being all good, because it's better that we are free. God, in his omnibenevolence, has made us free as opposed to making us not free. Okay, but now the evidential problem of evil, which is due to William Rowe. The problem on this argument is not that evil exists, but that there's too much evil. A perfect God could have made the world such that there's less evil. So maybe as Plantinga says, when it comes to moral evils, right, the evils that we do, that humans do, maybe some of those are because we have free will. There will always be humans who do terrible things, who murder, who torture, who start wars, who commit genocide, etc. These humans will always exist because we have free will. But couldn't God have made it so that there was a bit less evil? I mean, if some evil person starts a war, couldn't God make it such that fewer people die and fewer people suffer the horrors of war? What about natural evils, right? The Lisbon earthquake. Couldn't God have made it so that the earthquake wasn't as severe? Or couldn't he have made the earthquake occur somewhere else away from the city so that fewer people died? An all-powerful, omnibenevolent God should have been able to do that, right? Even think of other natural evils. I think the example that Crumley uses is a prey animal that's killed by a predator. Like, okay, predators need to eat. The pack of wolves needs to eat. But does the caribou that the wolves kill have to suffer so much? Does it have to really suffer for hours on end as it's slowly eaten by the pack of wolves? Um, I mean, it seems pretty convincing to me. I don't know what you think of this argument, but yeah, maybe there needs to be some evil when it comes to both the moral evils and the natural evils. But couldn't God have made it so that there was less suffering? That's the evidential problem of evil. So the way that it gets schematized is as follows. The first premise says that there exist instances of intense suffering that an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good, or preventing some evil equally bad or worse. And secondly, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. That is God. Again, you don't have to take this as saying that God doesn't exist, just that God is not as powerful or good as he's supposed to be. But honestly, I mean, if that's the case, he might as well not exist. The God that a lot of people believe in, who's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, does not exist. That is the takeaway here, right? At least some of this suffering could be prevented by God. So where Plantinga, in his response to Mackey, is focused on necessary evils, what William Rowe is doing is calling our attention to these unnecessary evils, right? The prey animal that suffers when it's caught by a predator. Um, the victims of war, of genocide, of murder, of torture, of rape, right? I mean, maybe some of that has to exist because humans are free, at least when it comes to the moral evils. Uh, but does it have to be so much? Um, so Roe sees this, similar to Mackey. Um, Roe sees the existence of an omnibenevolent God and an omnipotent God as incompatible with the existence of certain kinds of evil rather than evil in general. How do some people respond? Well, some might say maybe God knows best. We could be like children, and God is like a parent. Now, think of a child who has to go to the dentist. The child might see that as unnecessary suffering, but the parent knows it's for greater good. I remember this well. Um, Nobody likes getting cavities filled. Nobody likes having teeth pulled. Um, I know I always have a student in one semester or another who's got to have their wisdom teeth out. Um, and uh, and it's brutal. I was fortunate. I've had some wisdom teeth removed, but they were not impacted. So the doctor, the dentist, simply had to numb me up and, pop the tooth out. But I understand it's quite horrible if you have to be put under and you have to have the surgery, and it's like, oh, it sounds terrible. So, maybe that's unnecessary suffering. Well, yeah, maybe. But maybe it's necessary. If you have an impacted wisdom tooth or a very bad cavity, you might need to endure a little bit of suffering to prevent greater suffering later. So maybe that's what it's like. Again, I leave it up to you what you think of this. Um, I can certainly see the case. If I put myself in like the theist's shoes, I can accept that some suffering might be necessary. Some suffering might be necessary, might be good for building your character. A little, as Nietzsche said, a heart full of wonder and cheer needs a little adversity from time to time. Um, but I have a hard time with, uh, I'm somewhat sympathetic to Roe here. I have a hard time with the sheer amount of suffering in the world. Um, all around the world, there have been various atrocities committed by people, and it just seems like God could have made it less bad for some of the people that have gone through the things that they've had to go through. Um, God could make it so that um, prey animals don't suffer so much at the hands of predators, um, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, you might say, well, it's all good, Professor, because no matter how much suffering you undergo here, you're going to go to heaven, or whatever version of the afterlife you believe in, and then it's all good. Okay. If there is an afterlife, and if it is a nice afterlife, oh, sure, maybe I could accept having to go through some suffering, maybe even some brutal suffering while I'm on the planet Earth. But what if I end up in hell? What if I end up in Tartarus? Um, right? Then I have an eternity of suffering ahead of me, which does not sound too appealing. So I don't know. Does God know best? If God is omniscient, God ought to know best, and maybe what we think of as unnecessary suffering is really necessary. But of course, I think whether you accept this really depends on your inclinations. Whether you're already inclined toward atheism or agnosticism on the one hand, or some variety of belief in God on the other. Speaking of one of the previous points I mentioned, maybe this is suffering might be necessary to develop your character, to make you stronger. Everybody needs a challenge to overcome, right? So maybe some of the suffering is necessary for moral development or for people's relationship with the divine. Maybe, but I don't know. I think it depends on your inclinations. Are you inclined to believe in God and an afterlife? Sure, that if you are, then you might accept this line of reasoning that maybe a little suffering is important for the development of your soul or for your relationship with God. But if you're not so inclined, you're probably not going to find this all that convincing. And the last point, which I think is actually kind of a strange note to end the book on, is that maybe God participates in the suffering by becoming um, one of us. Of course, the example used is Christianity, where God sends himself, his son slash himself, because of the Holy Trinity and that whole thing, down to earth in order to pay for all of our sins by being brutally tortured and executed. Okay. I I just can't. Um, I think you kind of have to already be Christian to find this appealing. There are, of course, other non-Christian examples of God's coming down to earth and participating in human affairs. You see this in Hinduism, for example, where Krishna, like Krishna, for example, comes down to earth, and he's an avatar of Vishnu, one of the Hindu gods, right? And so he comes down on earth and does some earthly things. Um, I don't think he's brutally executed, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't know. At least if you take the example that Crumley employs in the book, yeah, how convincing you find it probably depends on whether you believe in Christianity or not. And I think it's kind of a strange way to end. Now, that's all I have for you today. I think you ought to give yourselves a big old pat on the back for making it through this entire textbook. This textbook doesn't look all that big, but there's a lot in here. Um, and you've stuck with it. You've made it through the material. You've read the book, I hope. You've been attending my lectures. Thank you especially to all of you who have been regularly attending the live lectures. I really appreciate it, and it's been a lot of fun. And you deserve a round of applause because this is one of the more difficult first year philosophy courses that I teach. Ignore this. Whoops, ignore that bit about the final exam. As you know, um, we don't have a formally scheduled final exam in this course. Rather, we have the essay. I'll say more about this next time when we have our little wrap up lecture on Thursday. But I'm going to be having the proposals all finished, all evaluated by the end of class. I mean, the end of courses. So by the 5th, you should all receive your marks and your feedback, and you can go ahead and write the final paper, which is a stand-in for the formally scheduled final exam, which is why you have until the last day of the exam period to complete it. All right. So thanks. Gosh, this has been weird. I'm talking to you as if you're all here, and you're not. Well, I guess you are. You're just watching it later. Um, But if you have any questions about today's material, please let me know. You can hop on the Discord server, ask me there, or you can ask me via email. Remember that all official communications should go through email, but if it's just a quick question about something we've covered today, the Discord server is fine. I'll see you all for our final lecture on Thursday, where we'll hold a little bit of wrap up and a little bit of discussion. We'll discuss what we've learned, what our favorite elements of the course were. I'll talk about the final exam or the final quiz, which now that you've seen this lecture, I think it's okay if you want to go ahead and complete it. Remember to follow the rules of the quiz. I did have some fishy stuff going on last time. I'll just say that. It's really important that you follow the instructions. No search engines, no generative AI, no copying and pasting. These answers must be written in your own words. And remember that the quiz is open book. You can consult our learning materials, but that's all you can consult. Well, and your own notes, but don't copy and paste. All right. Well, that's all I have for you today. I'll see you on Thursday. We'll wrap it up, talk about what we've learned, talk about the quiz if you want, ask me questions about your essay assignments if you want. I'll see you all on Thursday. Okay. Bye for now, everyone.